we'll now hear Sandra van der Leeuw from the Arizona State University. And Sandra will give us a little bit broader perspective on what we have said, and coming back, I think, to some basic principles also. We are sometimes forgetting.
Well, that's a pretty tall order. First of all, I have not been involved in archaeology much until after 1995, so I don't really know what's happening in archaeology. At that date, I moved into sustainability science, and I'm going to try and give you, from the perspective of somebody involved in sustainability as a social scientist, some comments that emerged yesterday and today on all of what you have said. Now, I'm going to do that in a very sketchy way, sort of pointillé. But because of that, I will probably be expressing things a little bit drastically in black and white that in reality aren't quite like that, which is sort of inevitable in what I'm trying to do here after having heard you guys only for about a day. Now I'm going to start off with a very wide perspective, and I'm going to go back to the two events that rocked Paris over the last months and a half. And I want to contrast them, and I want to contrast them based on a newspaper title which basically put the attacks on the 13th of November and the COP21 as an opposition of a longer term battle between globalization and the opposite. And I think, from what I've understood over the last day or two, that in a strange way, or maybe not so strange way, I can't say that, you as heritage people are actually engaged in that conflict. And it is one of the fundamental fields of tension in which you're trying to operate. And I find that that is not only very courageous, but I also think that it is very, very important. And in order to put the context to that, I'm to basically sketch out first what I think are the two main dilemmas that you are facing. And one of those is, I think, symbolized by the whole World Heritage movement, which, for the sake of black and white, I'm going to characterize as an aspect of post-colonialism and of an attempt to bring, through globalization, Western perspectives to bear on other parts of the world. My personal conviction is that the battle between globalization and local values is going to dominate the next 20 years at least. And that I therefore would argue that if you want to continue what you're doing in heritage, and again, I think that is hugely important, you need to begin to think about completely different ways of doing it. And I think Ian, with whom I've consulted very, very briefly, Gail will give you one example of how that can actually happen. But I want to underline another dilemma, which I came upon me yesterday as I was listening to the talks that were given in the Willem Willems Symposium. And that is that there are two fundamental different ways in which cultural heritage archaeology differs from scientific archaeology. Scientific archaeology comes out of the universalist tradition that we've had in the West for 2.5 centuries or maybe 3.5 centuries. It comes out of a positivist tradition, and it has as its aim effectively to look for origins. It does that because our Western intellectual scientific tradition, ever since the Royal Society in Britain and parallel movements in Germany and France, etc., have argued that you had to prove everything you had to say. And because you can't prove anything for the future, that tradition has only created a link for us between the past and the present. And we have not been able to look at the future from that perspective. There are a number of other dimensions to that. And one that I often mention in my classes is that I remind my students, they're all about sort of 20, so to the first time they fell in love. And I will tell them, look back to what happened when that just began. And you were completely confused because there were so many possibilities of what might happen that you didn't have a clue what would actually come out. But at the end, whether it was successful or not, you could create for yourself a historical narrative in terms of cause and effect that actually sort of rationalized, or in other ways narrativized, simplified actually the feelings that you went through. And I think that's really important because it highlights the fact that if we think about the future, we fundamentally don't think in the same terms as we think about the past. And I think that dilemma is one of your fundamental dilemmas in your relationship with standard archaeology. Much of standard archaeology is basically directed at finding origins for the present. What we are looking at and what you are living, because you're using archaeology to operate in a completely different social dimension, is actually that you have to think about the future. And so there is a sort of rupture between the results of the science, which gets you to a present, and then what do you do with that for the future? And those two things are, I think, very widely different things. And some of the disconnect that I sense between heritage archaeology and traditional archaeology are actually, I think, based on the fact that people are not sufficiently aware of this particular problem. Because what would you need to do to reintegrate those two? You would begin, and I've heard some rumoring in this community about that, but you would have to change archaeology itself. You would basically have to begin an archaeology that is based on the study of emergence rather than origins. So rather than have an ex post perspective, as much archaeology does now, you would need to develop an ex ante perspective that doesn't look at origins, but that looks at emergence over the long-term time, positioning yourself at a time before the phenomena you actually want to study. So I think that is, those two dilemmas are fundamental. I also want to add to some extent a third one, which is the fact that our positivist scientific tradition actually is very universalist. And its universalist aspect, I think to some extent, has led to the World Heritage Initiative. And it is therefore being sort of a counterpoint to the development of local initiatives. And I think that is an important part. Now, people have asked me about this concept of sustainability, and I have to talk about that. I hate that, to be one, but I'll try and do my best. You all know probably that sustainability came first as a term directly linked to development in the mid-80s when Gro Harlem Brundtland launched her first report on sustainable development. Little by little, in hard science at least, it has completely lost the concept of development. It has become all about sustainability per se. And that is in part due to the fact that the lead in that whole domain was then taken by the climate scientists. The climate scientists who basically only focus on CO2, NOx, and the other greenhouse gases. And for whom sustainability is, and that was again signaled in the COP, basically only a question of reducing greenhouse gases. Now, of course, that is far from realistic or true. And I have at one point committed myself in a paper that created a lot of furor to arguing that it is actually the real danger is that there are a number of deregulation mechanisms going on, even if we only think about the natural world, which, if they start colliding, will throw our Earth system completely out of whack and we won't know what to do anymore. Okay? Now that's not even taking the social dimension into account. So for 25 years, this became basically a climate science battle. Now you have to realize that climate science is one of the big industries of science. It eats hundreds of millions of dollars a year, or euros or whatever have you. And so what you see in many disciplines, what you have to some extent seen in the early days of contract archaeology, is that the money started dominating the thinking. And so I remember vividly a meeting in Vienna in the mid-90s where I was presented with 7 climate scenarios within 20 minutes. Because what was the aim career-wise of the climate scientists is to come up with the best scenario. And that's all. So I actually asked there, now all of this is fine and nice, but humanity has over time dealt with many changes in climate, and you don't even study how humanity deals with this. It's one of the 2 times in my life that my contribution was refused for the publication, because this was completely out of bounds and was unacceptable to the editors of the journal that came out afterwards. So sustainability for me is actually a chimera. It is something that doesn't exist. It's a wishful thinking about the future that because of that has had so much impact, because you can apply it to anything. Anything that you want to continue, you can try and strive for its sustainability. And that is, I think, to some extent, what is also I see in some of what you do. And I'm not judging that negatively. I'm simply pointing out that sustainability is an undefinable concept, and which we introduce because we live in a Western intellectual tradition that ever since Plato has effectively always said we have to strive towards a goal. If you contrast that with an Eastern tradition, they say, well, that goal, that's too far off. We're not going to worry about that. We're going to worry about our best behavior at the moment. And I think that is a very interesting, different perspective on sustainability studies. Now let me go a little bit towards archaeology in a different sense. I think sustainability, in the end, is designing for change, is deliberately taking the fact that change is an inevitable part of what is happening into account and preparing for it. That is to some extent where the word resilience comes in. There's a lot of terminological debate about that. I don't want to go into that. But I do want to emphasize that for a very long time, and this is changing, and it's very good that it's changing, archaeology had sort of a model through long-term time that said that stability was the norm and change had to be explained. I think it's the other way around. And I think change is in nature and in people and everywhere actually what happens anyway. And what we need to start explaining is how human societies, by controlling change, have tried to create stability, which is the inverse of what we're doing in many ways. Then the next issue that sort of derives from this is, well, what do we sustain? And that's been asked this morning, and I was on the same point going to ask the same question. And I think one of the interesting things is to look at where the concept of sustainability came from intellectually. I think you can distinguish 3 phases. Sort of the 80s and before, in which basically there was an underlying hypothesis that humans adapted to nature. Then we had the phase of the environmentalists, when that was inverted, and we basically said humans are proactive in nature, not adaptive. That then led to what was popularly called the tree huggers and other people, who basically said, well, most interventions of humans in nature are effectively negative and destroy things. Finally, sort of late 90s, 20s, we begin to balance that out. And we have begun to realize that what it's all about is the interaction between society and the environment. And that brings the society back into the equation, and that is where you have a great strength because you're looking at that aspect at a time that most sustainability scientists are not yet looking at that aspect. So that's sort of one of my sort of topics that I wanted to raise today. Now, another one is that of values, and I was prompted by you to say something about that. And I want to start with two examples. One that is directly related to what you all do. My last archaeological project was actually discovering the Roman Industrial Revolution, I would say, for the time, in the northeast of France, in the Argonne area. And we did that. We spent a number of years working on that, surveying, excavating, and so on and so forth. And then we also had lived there, and while living there, realized that this area suffers from a long-term depression, which it has inherited from the First World War. And so we said, well, you all have only tourists who come and visit you to look at either trenches or war cemeteries. Why don't we try and give you a different past? Why don't we make value of all the stuff that is there in the Roman period, which is one of the first industrial revolutions in a sense, and in that area is very lively. And then we hurt ourselves against the fact that they didn't want it. They didn't want to be made up to date. They didn't want to integrate the rest of France. They actually said, we love our liminal position so that nothing can happen and we can keep our past. That, I think, is an interesting lesson about how, in your case, in all of your cases, values play a role. And I want to give you one more extreme example that I owe to my wife, who is sitting in the back, because she brought me to Papua New Guinea, where she was working. And one day, our friend and guide in that country ran a little store in his village. And every time that we came back, he wanted us to stock his store so that he could then sell it while we were away. And so he came back and asked for money, which was fine. It wasn't a big amount. But the interesting thing was that I tried for 24 hours with a little calculator to demonstrate to him that he should sell his things for a little more than he bought them for. And that was absolutely impossible. And why was that impossible? Because for him, the value in the store had nothing to do with money. It had only to do with the fact that it gave him a status in the village. He was not somebody from a high-ranked family or with high-ranked ancestors, so he needed a raison d'être in his own village. That's another really interesting warning about what we do when we actually try and use Western values in inappropriate situations. Now, I'm not saying that every situation is inappropriate. I saw in the Jordanian case, for example, you have people there who have so much already absorbed of Western thinking that they actually sort of take this in a stride, and that for them it is important. I just want to give you a warning about this particular thing, and basically launch two questions. First one, do all societies want that kind of economic boost that comes from a World Heritage Site? But then, and I get back to that later on, should all societies want it? And then I'll come back to sustainability with that. So what I'm basically saying is that, no, I'll skip that next bit, that's okay. All right, so now we look to the concept of value, and we heard earlier on somebody argue that we needed more anthropology. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. But I also want to warn you about economic anthropology. I once was at a SAA conference a long number of years ago, which ended up being, in one particular seminar, the end of economic anthropology viewed by anthropologists. There was a debate over the head of some very poor PhD person who had just finished his PhD between two cadres, two leaders of, on the one hand, an anthropological vision on value, which was a very highly multidimensional value, and an economic anthropologist who was more like a macroeconomist, and who basically argued that everybody is rational and all these other values, we just ditch them because then it's easier to put it all in formulas and we end up having a coherent economic vision. One of the real problems, I think, if I have a bit more time, yeah, I think I do, is that after decolonization, anthropology lost its bearings in some ways, because most anthropologists were torn between their allegiance to their own culture and the culture they had been studying. And because of that confusion, which then ended up in a very constructive way in post-processual archaeology and anthropology, postmodern anthropology, what we began to see is that anthropology went all over the place, and economics at the same time, over the same 50 years, built an empire that is now confronted with sustainability, and which for sustainability scientists is one of the most difficult things to actually deal with. So I just want to say, yes, more anthropology, but let's take that anthropology that is multi-value, that does acknowledge other values than only the economic, okay? Now, you do a lot of that, implicitly almost, but maybe also for those who speak explicitly, when you basically say what you do with these World Heritage Sites is also giving people a sense of identity. And it's very clear that that is badly needed and that is strengthening the movement, but it's also fragmenting the world. And so we need to find our balance between those aspects, the identity aspects, which are local aspects and which are different from culture to culture, and the economic aspects, which are universalist and which are sort of part of the globalization process. Now, let me see what I have here. I think that's about right. So, I did that. The last thing I want to do is again talk about past, present and future. And basically say, well, what is creating a sustainable future for ourselves? What does it take? What can you all contribute to it? And I go back to the sentence that I launched earlier on, that basically what we need to be doing is designing for change. And that we need to design for change in our own disciplines. An architect needs to design for change, because otherwise we will always have this long-term discrepancy between what the world at that moment wants and what the architecture actually provides us with. We need to do the same thing in our own disciplines. We need to start looking at, well, not necessarily change how, but the fact that change is there. That is what circular economics is all about. And building buildings who then are not the owner, owned by the owner, but are rented by the owner, part for part. Every iron beam is actually rented separately, so that the building can be taken apart and reconfigured. This is something that's happening quite close to here in Haarlemmermeer, which is a really interesting part. And so what we need to start doing is taking, and that is why I'm very involved in complex systems thinking, we need to begin to realize what drives those changes. And ever since the Industrial Revolution, it became so cheap in energy terms to change things socially that we ended up being addicted to innovation. We're right now, as a society, entirely addicted to innovation. For a long time in the archaeological past, innovation was demand dependent. Right now it is supply dependent. Some inventor invents something, a corporation buys it, and then puts up a huge advertising campaign, and then we all buy it. Okay? Now what is part of that is that we have lots of unintended consequences. And we have just gone through a huge crisis. And I would argue that that crisis, whether it's in an environmental domain or an economic or a financial or a social, where we're heading towards it, we actually are dealing with our incapacity to deal with the unintended consequences of our earlier actions. We have, over the last 2 centuries, and certainly the last century, gone in a very particular direction, and that is now raising so many difficulties that we need to start thinking about how we can actually do it differently. And one of the ways in which we can, I think, do it differently is by basically saying our globalization is driven by what is actually a very narrow value set. And if we can enlarge that value set by creating more diversity in the societies that we deal with, by giving them the emphasis to do things their way rather than confronting them with our way, we will actually have gained, I think, a huge bonus in the area of sustainability. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.